Today we're talking about, was Catherine the Great a successful ruler of Russia? So last week we talked about this idea of, can a despot be enlightened? And so today we're going to look at particularly at the life and times of Catherine the Great. And don't buy my son, he's just hungry. I'm going to be getting dinner soon. He's being a little bit of a crank. So the first question is, how did Catherine the Great come to power in Russia? So a little bit about Catherine. First off, her name is not Catherine, and she's not even Russian. Her name was Sophia, and she was from Prussia. But so Russia had no philosophes. Russia does not have an enlightenment. It's an incredibly authoritarian state, and they don't really allow things like that. But their ideas were well known. The Russians were very interested in French culture, especially starting with Peter the Great, who kind of made everyone speak French and act very Western. So French was the conversational language in the Russian court. Now, between Peter and Catherine, so Peter the Great, and then when Catherine the Great comes to power, there's a succession of czars that ruled for a short time, except for the Tsarina Elizabeth, who ruled for 21 years. So Catherine is Peter III's wife. Peter III is Elizabeth's nephew. And Catherine herself is from a small house in the Holy Roman Empire. She marries Peter at 15. She comes to Russia. She learns the language. She adopts the Russian Orthodox religion. And she was pretty popular with the people. Her and her husband did not get along together at all. In fact, she was very disgusted with her husband. And she saw an opportunity to rule on her own. So her husband was dethroned and then assassinated by a group of boyars, who were Russian nobles, that were acting in Catherine's name. Now, that's a little bit sketchy. So Catherine and Peter, like I said, had a really, really, really tumultuous marriage. They did not get along very well. They did have one son together. Peter had a lot of mental deficiencies. And was obsessed with Prussia, which is why he was kind of excited about marrying her, because she was from the Holy Roman Empire. But he even modeled Russian army uniforms on the Prussian army, and actually pretty much the Russian army was winning in a war against the Prussians, and he pretty much surrenders just because he didn't want to upset the Prussians. That's how much he loved Prussia. So probably had Catherine not even been there, he probably would have been overthrown, because he really was not very popular amongst the boyars. So when Peter is dethroned, she tries to separate herself from it as much as possible, and tries to say that she didn't realize that her husband would eventually be assassinated. She thought he was just being, again, taken off the throne. She tries to kind of distance herself from the actual assassination of her husband, because technically it's her son who's supposed to be ruling. But instead, she just never lets her son have that power, which creates a bad relationship between her and her son. She's kind of famous for having many different lovers, and she would use them in various different positions of state. She made one of her lovers the King of Poland, excuse me. But after becoming empress, she did do many things for herself personally. And she didn't like the servants kind of fawning over her and doing all these different things for her. She was very well read, and she corresponded greatly with Voltaire and Diderot. And she visited... And when Diderot visited St. Petersburg, at that point, now Diderot's the guy who was the first person to publish the encyclopedia, and he had this amazing library of books, and Diderot was very down on his luck financially. So as a result, she didn't want him to be, didn't want his library to be broken up. So she bought his whole library and allowed him to keep it for the rest of his life, so that that library would remain intact, because she thought that was something that was very important. So she definitely did try to act in an enlightened way. And she won renown for being a benefactor to many philosophers. And she came to power with the intention of making enlightened reforms. So that's one of her lovers who ruled with her. That's Catherine the First. Sorry, Catherine the First, if you remember, is Peter the Great's wife, who ascends the throne after her. Empress Anne, she's the niece of Peter, so it's Catherine, which is Peter's wife. Then it's Catherine's niece, Empress Anne, and then there's Peter II, and then his Aunt Elizabeth winds up ruling for a very long time, like I said, for 21 years. Ivan IV rules for a brief period of time. There's a succession of rulers that don't rule for very long. Empress Elizabeth was the legitimized daughter of Peter the Great, meaning she was probably illegitimate and then legitimized later. That's Peter the Great's grandson. That's Catherine and her husband Peter and their son Paul wearing a turban. So Catherine the Great is going to wind up ruling from 1762 to 1796. So she's going to have a pretty long reign. And like I said before, her name was not Catherine, her name was Sophia. And that is her son, Emperor Paul. So, did Catherine actually make these enlightened changes in Russia? So, in 1767, she convenes a legislative commission to go out into the countryside, travel through the countryside of Russia, and make proposals on what she felt needed to be changed in the country. She wanted to see things like legal codification, meaning laws the same across the country. She wanted to restrict the use of torture. And she wanted to allow some level of religious toleration. And she wanted to divide the governments of Russia into 50 districts and kind of like share power across the country. But there was a great deal of tension that developed between the landlords and the peasants. And in 1763, there was this rather large rebellion known as Pugachev's Rebellion. And that's a picture of Pugachev. And there you can see kind of like the area of Russia where Pugachev's rebellion breaks out. And basically, the conditions for the serfs were getting really, really bad in Russia. There was a lot of class antagonism. And so this guy, Pugachev, in 1773, he announces himself as the true czar. He says he's, in fact, Peter III, because remember, Peter III was dethroned and, is assassinated by the boyars, but it's kind of like mysterious circumstances. So he kind of pretends that he's actually Peter III and he's the rightful guy to be ruling the country. So he surrounds himself with duplicates of the royal family. He has a Secretary of State. He actually pretends that he's actually governing the country. He starts holding court. He ends serfdom. He ended taxes. He ended the draft, and he managed to create a movement where he got the support of tens of thousands of people. He eventually was captured. He was brought to Moscow in an iron cage. And Catherine, who was someone who was against torture, had him drawn and quartered, which means basically hung until you're just about dead, taken out of the noose, and then cut up into 4 pieces while you're still alive, which is a very brutal form of death. And so Catherine's response to Pugachev's rebellion was actually to become more oppressive. So this was a turning point in her reign. She was trying to have legitimate intentions of being enlightened, and then that really kind of ends when her power was challenged in any way, big, shape, or form. And part of it is she needed the support of the boyars to govern because they're the ones that brought her to power in the first place. She really has no basis of power on her own. And so the state really rested on an understanding between her and the nobles. So the nobles had to accept the monarchy's power, accept her laws, accept her officials and army. And in return for them obeying her, she gave them full authority over the serfs. And so under Catherine the Great, even though she wanted to be enlightened, the numbers of serfs increased greatly, and really we see serfdom become like slavery as we see in North America, which then takes us to this question: how did Catherine get the title of Great? So what did she do to actually earn that title? And it's usually taking over land, and that's what she's going to do. So she basically oversees the partition of Poland, which we're going to talk about on Wednesday. And so she oversaw the partition of Poland. She ends a war with the Ottoman Empire, but she also manages to gain a great deal of land. So if you notice, if you look at the Black Sea, the northern coast of the Black Sea, including the Crimean Peninsula, is under the empire of all Russia. So that is land that she acquired during her time as Tsarina. So her reign also, her expansionist reign was interrupted by the French Revolution. So the French Revolution, she is ruling Russia while the French Revolution is going on, which we're going to start later this week. She basically wanted Austria and Prussia to get in a war with France in order to basically have kind of cover so that she could continue to expand land in Poland and in the Ottoman Empire. She killed off any nationalist and reforming movements that Poland is going to develop. And her foreign policy was very expansionist and in a lot of ways unscrupulous, but not very enlightened at all. because she knew that if Russia was going to expand, she needed a supportive nobility because she knew she could be overthrown. Now, again, she knew she didn't really have a very good relationship with her son, so she kind of like ignored her son in a way, and gave a lot of attention to her grandson, Alexander. Um, and she kind of made sure that he was educated as a liberal and had lots of philosophers surrounding him, and she really hoped to make him into the enlightened despot that she couldn't really be. So we see that Maria Theresa had an issue where she couldn't quite carry out all the enlightened ideas that she wanted to. Joseph II had the same issue, and Catherine also had that similar problem. And she really hoped that her grandson would kind of be the one to carry on her ideas of enlightenment. Her son Paul rules for a very short period of time. Let's talk about this side in a second. But her son Paul rules for a very short period of time. He was very unpopular, and he was basically assassinated in his bed. And then her grandson Alexander winds up coming to the throne. So just to kind of show you, like, again, we're going to talk about this in more detail on Wednesday. This is the partitions of Poland. And so we can see there's going to be 3 partitions that are going to happen that eventually is going to lead to Poland kind of disappearing off the map and not coming back until World War I. So this is the palace where Catherine is most associated with, where she ruled, where she lived, Tarske Selo, and I'm probably mispronouncing that. But here we can see some of the expansion of Russia during this time period, the land that they gained in Poland, and the land she gained from the Ottomans. So here we can see just a little overview again of Catherine. So in 1767, she summons a legislative commission with all these ideas of, making Russia more enlightened. But then Pugachev's rebellion is suppressed, and we see the partition of Poland, the second partition of Poland, and the third partition of Poland. So in the end, do you think Catherine the Great was a successful ruler?